Hi everybody, it's Laura. Sorry I didn't get to see you for this lecture, but here it is recorded. So you've been thinking about the ideas around activism, and I wanted us to think about the role that advocates might play in this, and in particular I wanted to think about advocates supporting people with psychiatric impairment. To do this then I want to use some ideas that have been developed by Miranda Fricker, who's a UK-born philosopher but now is in the US, and some of her ideas around something she refers to as epistemic injustices. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the word epistemic, or if you've ever heard of epistemology, but essentially it's around the theory of knowledge. So different theories about what we understand knowledge is. So Fricker describes how epistemic injustice prevents some groups from contesting, distorting understandings of their social experiences. She says that epistemic injustice occurs when a person is wronged specifically in her capacity as a knower. And that epistemic injustice is foundational to other forms of social injustice because the capacity as a giver of knowledge is intrinsic to human value. So epistemic injustice then, it occurs when a person's capacity to have knowledge about something is called into question and they're not taken seriously as a knower. Yeah. So a person with psychiatric impairment, for example, their understanding of something that they may have experienced is contested because they somehow lack capacity as a knower. And Fricker suggests that there are two types of epistemic injustices. The first of these being testimonial injustices. So here she says that these arise when an individual's word is afforded less credibility or invalidated through discounting or diminishing their account, creating a credibility deficit. She also suggests that that this reflects the prejudice on negative stereotypes that are associated with a particular social identity. And then she describes this thing as identity prejudicial credibility deficit, a bit of a mouthful. But this becomes the paradigm case for testimonial injustice. So there are certain ideas attached to particular identities, many of which are based on negative stereotypes, and that these stereotypes then create a credibility deficit, if you like. So people are seen as less credible. Oops. Okay. So if we think about these three labels then, schizophrenia, bipolar affective disorder or personality disorder, if we think about these three labels in particular, in terms of someone with one of these labels being seen as a knower, just pause this for a moment and note down what negative stereotypes there might be about people with these labels. When you've done that, also think about how these might impact them being seen, being listened to, if you like. How might things they say be taken by mental health professionals? Okay, so the irrational stereotyping and prejudice associated with mental distress has been identified as more deleterious, harmful than the conditions themselves. Thought that's Thornycroft there. And that common stereotypes then foster negative perceptions that people experiencing mental distress are delusional or emotionally unstable, unpredictable, untruthful, untrustworthy, lacking all capacity for rational thought, and invariably dangerous to oneself and to others. So these are some of the common stereotypes surrounding those particular psychiatric impairments. And as I say, as Thornycroft argues there, that actually the ideas around what those particular impairments are, those ideas are actually more harmful than those particular experience, those particular psychiatric impairments, if you like. The second then of Fricker's epistemic injustices then is the hermeneutical injustice. And hermeneutical then is around the kind of the theory of interpretation. So how something is interpreted. So she says here, hermeneutical injustice refers to the cognitive disadvantage when trying to make sense of social experiences as a consequence of gaps in our collective understanding. Okay. This arises when there is a lack of conceptual resources for understanding experience, influenced by dominant social norms and values privileging particular types of knowledge. So gaps in our collective understanding then, how we understand psychiatric impairment is not something that everybody agrees on. Yeah, so people have very different interpretations of what is happening. And this type of injustice happens when we're not able to access a range of ideas about our experiences because there is a privileging of particular types of knowledge in a society. So what might that knowledge be? What knowledge do we in the UK and more broadly in the West, what type of knowledge is privileged in our society? So in terms of psychiatric impairment then, understanding about what this experience is completely dominated by biomedical knowledge. Yeah. So that's the first. The second then is that psychiatrists are thus the knowers who give them the power over the person with the psychiatric impairment. And any other type of knowledge has got no credibility, if you like. And then the last thing here then in terms of use of evidence, in terms of the search for evidence to substantiate what someone's experience is, then again this is dominated by biomedical theories. Yeah. So the argument here being that there are that if we only use those theoretical frameworks in order to make sense of the experiences of psychiatric impairment, then that dominates it and it doesn't allow for other. So there are gaps that fall between what, say I, for example, the way in which I might make sense of my psychiatric impairment versus that of a psychiatrist that I might see. And so the testimony of people experiencing mental distress is therefore at high risk of being viewed as irrelevant or unreliable, and therefore ignored, downgraded or rejected, thus justifying their exclusion from decision making about their lives and increasing the likelihood of compulsion. So unlike perhaps people with other types of impairment, People with psychiatric impairment and also people with the label of learning difficulties are much more likely to have their knowledge, their understanding of their experiences called into question, possibly ignored, or just rejected completely. Yeah, it is not necessarily valued or seen as valid or reliable. Okay, so having thought about then these epistemic injustices that people with psychiatric impairment might experience, I next want us to think a little bit about the way that advocacy and advocates can help in addressing some of those epistemic injustices, if you like. Again, just stop the lecture here and note down what you understand by the term advocacy. What are advocates? So this slide then just gives a bit of an overview of how advocacy might be captured. So it aims to enable people to have a voice, to express their needs and wishes and protect their rights. So very much an enabling process that's involved. It creates space for different forms of knowledge within an unequal power dynamic that privileges professionals' authority over that of lived experiences. So a really important part of thinking about some of these epistemic injustices that might come from the power that psychiatrists or psychologists have over the person with psychiatric impairment, and advocacy can act as can really play a role in trying to challenge that kind of authority. Advocacy is fundamentally concerned with seeing the world from the perspective of marginalised individuals. So most professionals, come from privileged backgrounds. So advocacy allows, it's very much about trying to understand the person who you might be enabling in this advocacy relationship. It's about really getting to know them and really understanding their position, where they come from. It serves to address power asymmetries, protect rights and promote social justice through greater empowerment and democratic participation of voices that might otherwise be silenced. In terms of psychiatric impairment then, there are specific advocates that within legislation a person must have, and they're referred to as independent mental health advocates, IMAHs. So they provide a statutory advocacy, and in particular they're for people who may be subjected to compulsion under mental health legislation. So you can find out a little bit more about the role of those particular types of advocates if you go to the description box underneath this lecture on YouTube. You'll find a link there to a clip that explains a bit more about what those particular professions do. In thinking a little bit then about advocates' roles within tackling epistemic injustices, these two researchers here conducted a study in particular that explored the extent to which mental health advocates were able to assist people with psychiatric impairment in tackling epistemic injustices, and I just want to touch on some of the findings from this. So one participant was highlighting the frustration of not being seen as a knower. So this participant said, I feel like I'm howling at the moon, no matter how coherent, how rational, how considered my arguments and my explanations for events are. That assumed level of incompetence undermines it because you're given sub-status. Advocates seem to be able to tackle Fricker's testimonial injustices also. So one participant says, I've got more of a voice through having an IMHA, and because they know all the rules and regulations, I can confront the mental health team and say I know things, and the IMHA service will back me up. Another person said they provide help to people who need support to be able to speak up for themselves, get their views across, get their wishes and feelings out and shared with the professionals, so that the person isn't just left to be dragged along by the system. You feel as if you've got no rights and no control over anything that's going on in your life, and the advocates can make sure that you're not being forgotten or abused or denied your rights. So one of the things that we find is that often just the very presence of an advocate is able to alter the way that the person with psychiatric impairment was talked to, and was then seen as a person who had a voice, and practitioners became much more kind of interested in their views, if you like. And I can connect with this as someone who has acted as an advocate on a number of occasions. Actually, the difference in dynamic when you're there, I think that it really impacts. It can really change the behaviour of the medical professionals when there is an advocate present. Another person here said, it opens it up, makes things transparent, changes the dynamic. There is so much secrecy around mental health, around wards, and it's bullshit that staff give off. Staff are the ones that enforce it and protect it more than anybody else. The more they are in here, rummaging around and opening this place up, the more that light comes up, that comes on, and it is more open and transparent it becomes. So the advocates also then seen that to alter the power dynamic and to enable the questioning of professional practice, if you like, because there were another person who was able to, to observe and ask questions that, someone who might be experiencing psychiatric impairment does not feel able to do. In terms of the extent to which advocates were able to shift or address what we referred to as the hermeneutical injustices then, so things around the gaps in knowledge, then the findings suggested that there was less evidence that advocates were able to do that. So that idea of being able to work with the person with the psychiatric impairment and the medical professional in order to open up alternative conceptual frameworks. And again, I'd like you to just perhaps stop here and to think about why it might be. So why advocacy was able to play a role in the testimonial injustices, but why they perhaps are less effective in terms of dealing with the hermeneutical injustices. Okay, so there could be two possible reasons for this then. First, the context of compulsion and experience of fearfulness and disempowerment mean that advocates focus on securing rights and the immediate issues rather than broader hermeneutic and ontological concerns. This potentially engenders compliance with the dominant paradigm of mental distress, resulting in epistemic objectification and a disconnection from their experience, which is likely to impact negatively. So I guess this idea then that you might only really be given access to an advocate at the point at which you're about to be detained. So legally, that's the point at which you're entitled to that particular type of advocate. And of course, during that moment of real distress and real complexity in terms of enforcing someone, forcing someone to come into a psychiatric unit, etc., then often the focus then just remains on ensuring that someone's rights are being upheld, and therefore any idea around being able to really work with thinking about offering up different conceptual frameworks for thinking about mental distress, probably gets lost in that. And then second, the purpose of the advocate is prescribed in legislation and potentially limits their scope, with some questioning how much these advocates could really achieve given the problematic nature of compulsion. So I think as well, one of the things that's really important about any advocacy is that they should be, they shouldn't be employed by the government. They should be seen as people who truly are independent. And, research suggests that sometimes with these particular types of advocates, because they are unlike other, advocates, because it's kind of written up in law about people having those, then some argue that actually that kind of really limits what people feel that they are able to do, if you like. And I just want to get you to finish by actually thinking a little bit about how you might think about advocacy in terms of challenging those hermeneutical injustices. And what would be good is if in class you were able to perhaps think about, so if we think about there's an easy read, I'm just showing their images of the easy read leaflet about independent mental health advocates. What might you add to this kind of leaflet that isn't just about your rights, but also is about tackling some of the ways in which you could support medical practitioners with recognising that there are other ways of conceptualising mental distress.